In the early 19th century, anarchists like Emma Goldman and Alexander Beckman championed a radical vision of a world without states, laws, or private property. Militant and sometimes violent, anarchists were heroes to many working-class immigrants. But to many Americans, anarchism was a terrifyingly foreign ideology that struck at the heart of the nation's values. These are issues that my next guest is quite critical of. His new book, American Anarchy, the epic struggle between immigrant radicals and the US government at the dawn of the 20th century, was published by Basic Books. This book was a finalist for the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for History. If you'd like to get a copy of this book, click the link that is in the description panel on the upload for this video. Enjoy the show. Professor Michael Willrich, thank you so much for making the time. I'm the happiest man to have you today. I was even happy. I should say congratulations for publishing this book. I was happy to listen to your presentation when you came to UMass to present. I'm sure you remember this very spot right here. I remember you standing
I do.
on this podium. So I was interested in the book. I'm sure you remember that I was the first person to ask you your question. I found it very, very interesting. So I want us to get started with our discussion, and I want you to briefly just introduce yourself, tell us about the work that you do. We want to know about your research interests. We want to know the classes that you're teaching at Brandeis University and the works that you've been publishing right before this particular book.
Sounds great. And thanks so much, Tita, for having me. So I teach at Brandeis University, which is a research university, a liberal arts college just outside of Boston. I've been there since 1999, so a long time. I teach graduate students and undergraduate students, and my main fields are social and legal history of the United States. So I teach courses on crime and punishment, on the development of political institutions in the United States, and also my kind of bread and butter course, which ties closely into my research, is about the dynamics of legal and social change in America from the colonial period of the early 17th century all the way up to the present. In terms of books, so I've written 3 books now. Each of them digs into a specific problem in the social and legal history of the United States. The first one was about crime and criminal justice in the late 19th and early 20th century as American social reformers and legal scholars and lawyers and really just kind of everyday people reconsidered how they understood the causes of crime and the responsibilities for crime in an urban industrial society. And I explore the way these new ideas about what they called the social responsibility for crime really played out in American legal institutions. My second book was about the last great smallpox epidemic in the United States, this deadly disease that killed 300 million people worldwide in the 20th century alone. The last great wave of smallpox epidemics in the United States took place around the turn of the 20th century, and it generated enormous controversy and conflict over the government policy of compulsory vaccination mandates. And those controversies ended up as many important questions in the United States do in the courts. And so I sort of trace the development of these legal issues. And there are powerful resonances with our own 21st century politics of public health, and particularly during the COVID pandemic. And then this most recent book is a book that we'll be talking about today, which is about the anarchist movement in the United States between the 1880s and the 1920s. The government efforts to stamp out the anarchist movement, and the legal controversies that arose from those efforts. And I make I tell a pretty big story and develop a pretty big argument about the significance of those.
Nice. That's interesting. Right. So I studied, closely your biography and your CV, and I could see that your interest in the period of the turn of the 20th century, or if I can say the progressive era in the history of the United States. You have a very particular, a specific interest on that area. Your first book partly covers, it actually covers that area as well. That's the same thing with your second book. That's the same thing with your third book. What can you say is something what are the interesting major points, major themes that you like so much about this particular time frame of the history of the United States?
So it's the period I'm looking at is really the 1880s through the 1920s. This is the era when the United States became a modern urban industrial society. And the changes that are going on during this period are, really dramatic and kind of have a very intense impact in the society. So slavery has been abolished, but a new industrial system is emerging, and including a system of wage labor that many critics compare to a new form of enslavement because of the kind of levels of exploitation and the relative weakness of the labor movement relative to the employers. It's also a period of extraordinary sort of expansion in the industrial economy and the rise of corporate capitalism in the United States. Really large modern business corporations with enterprises on a national scale emerged during this period. It's the moment when mass immigration really takes off, to the point that around the turn of the 20th century, there are about 1 million new immigrants arriving each year. And they're arriving from new sources where U.S. immigration streams previously had tended to come mostly from Northern and Western Europe, creating a society that thought of itself as, Anglo-Saxon and white. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the immigrant streams are coming primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe. Jews from the Russian Empire, Italians from Southern Italy, in particular. And these groups are being seen by native stock white Americans as members of distinct and new and sort of troubling races. Meanwhile, in the same period, more and more Americans are calling upon their government to do new kinds of things, to control epidemics, to regulate industry, to control immigration, to police cities. And in the process, we get the development of modern institutions of the state. So this is that context. And so I really look at the way in which relatively ordinary Americans are experiencing these changes and the consequences of the decisions that are made to the kind of large public questions of this era.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I love how you explained it perfectly well. I can already tell from this background discussion the very specific target audience for this book, but we'll talk about that later. So now I I want you to take me through the process of, or the experiences of how you developed the argument, and the conceptualization of this particular book. I'm sure you received some funding, to carry out this research, from the readings I did on your CV. Can you tell us about that, and then get us into a discussion of the core ideas of the book and what you consider to be the central argument?
Sure. So in terms of funding, I've been, very fortunate to receive very generous funding from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Guggenheim Foundation, from my own institution at Brandeis University, and also from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the government endowment. So those fellowships enabled me, basically bought time for me to not teach, to not be engaged in my usual administrative responsibilities, and to really do research in the archives, and finally to write the book. And the book started, the project emerged in my research in the Harry Weinberger papers at Yale University's archives. These were the papers left behind by a New York lawyer in the early 20th century who was the children of immigrants himself, a Jewish lawyer educated at a night school, law school in New York City at NYU. Went on and sort of hung out a shingle as a solo practitioner lawyer, and handled all kinds of normal kind of real estate and commercial cases. But he really gravitated towards cases involving individuals making a claim of personal liberty against the government. And so one of his earliest cases in this regard was representing parents who refused to get their children vaccinated in accordance with public school vaccination laws. And he represented these parents who insisted that this was a violation of their parental autonomy and their children's health and bodily integrity, and a lot of ideas that have become familiar to us today were really emerging during this period. And as I dug through Harry Weinberger's papers, I came to appreciate the full sort of scope of what civil liberties meant in the early 20th century. It wasn't just about speech. It was also about freedom of belief, freedom of the body, claims to kind of absolute autonomy of the individual, of the sort that most courts weren't ready to accept at the time, but that there could be a case built for these ideas in the provisions of the Constitution and the common law. And that's the kinds of arguments that he was making in kind of one area after another, most dramatically in his cases where he represented anarchists. And so he became one of the most important lawyers in the United States, or most involved in defending anarchists against the US government. And that's how I sort of started to sort of build this story. And I'm happy to tell you more about that.
Oh, yes. So now what's the central argument of the book?
Yeah, so the story of the book, the sort of narrative of the book, is a political history and legal history of anarchism in the United States. Anarchism was a transnational movement. Its origins, it emerged around the same time as Marxism, and also as sort of liberal ideas of society and the rule of law in the age of revolutions and through the course of the 19th century, in response to the growth of capitalism and the emergence of nation states and broad-based movements for change. But anarchism had a distinct set of ideas. The anarchists believed that the world would be a better place without government, without law, without marriage, without organized religion, and above all, without private property. So unlike Marxian socialists who tended to envision change occurring through a kind of revolution that would lead to a new kind of state, the anarchists really believed that real liberty, that true human freedom, could only fully exist in the absence of nations, in the absence of states. That they believe that government itself was founded in coercion and violence, and that ideas like the rule of law were really window dressing for capitalist interests. So the book traces the history of a movement that was very much kind of directed by immigrants. And it argues that, in fact, this movement was not, as its critics in America suggested, simply an importation of foreign ideas or contagions, but that, in fact, the anarchist movement in the United States grew out of the immigrants' experiences in the industrial capitalist system, which was quite dangerous, in which their efforts to organize the labor movement were violently suppressed by the police, in which there was also rising anti-immigrant nativism in the late 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And I examined the way in which the anarchists in the United States, through their efforts to persuade the working class to rise up,
Mm-hmm.
right, and create a revolution,
Mm-hmm.
they pursued both violent means and nonviolent means, and they really debated about whether or not terrorism was a legitimate approach or not, or whether persuasion must be achieved through peaceful means.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole debate over that. But they, in the process of developing their arguments for a just society, they were met at kind of every turn by local police forces and by the federal government, leading to, by the turn of the 20th century, a full-scale kind of war against anarchists in the United States, involving police suppression of anarchist publications, the police breaking up anarchist meetings in public squares, and at the kind of most powerful example of government action was using the federal government, the national government in the United States, using the immigration laws to bar immigrants with radical ideas from entering the country, and also to deport non-citizens who had been in the country for years, sometimes even decades, simply for their political beliefs. And then the argument of the book is that, you know, in the kind of clash and encounters between anarchists and their government enemies, that the anarchists got very involved in the legal system. They worked with sympathetic lawyers who, in representing their cases, helped to really set the terms of the modern civil liberties movement in the United States, including the right to free speech, free assembly, rights that we now take for granted in the United States. So it's a big sort of history of anarchism that looks at the way in which this political story of anarchism led to two lasting features of American life. On the one hand, the surveillance state, and on the other hand, the modern civil liberties movement.
Wonderful. That is excellent. I want you to give me two examples, 2 or 3 if you can, but feel very free. We have all the time. This is the platform to talk about this. I want you to give me examples of these anarchists and their experiences.
Sure. So two of the central figures in my book are Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. They were world famous in the early 20th century. Emma Goldman, in particular, was her picture or her name appeared on the front pages of American newspapers all the time. They had immigrated. Each of them had immigrated to the United States from the Russian Empire in the 1880s. They were both Russian Jews. They worked in various industrial jobs, and they met each other in the late 1880s in New York City on the Lower East Side, which was really the kind of the heart of Jewish America during this period. And there's also a very sort of crowded tenement neighborhood that had a very fertile political life and filled with labor radicals and so on. They early on in their work together as anarchist comrades, they kind of hatched this plan to assassinate the industrialist Henry Clay Frick in Pennsylvania, who had brutally suppressed a labor strike in 1892 at one of Andrew Carnegie's steel plants. And this was unsuccessful, as were most of their efforts at terrorism. Alexander Berkman went into the offices of Henry Clay Frick in Pittsburgh and fired 2 bullets into him. Frick did not die, but Berkman was sentenced to 21 years in prison. Goldman, meanwhile, became a public figure in the United States for speaking out against unemployment, for demanding better rights for working class people, for criticizing anti-immigration sentiment, for making unprecedented and illegal arguments in support of birth control and the rights of working class people to know the techniques of birth control in order to prevent having large families. She was prosecuted for these things, arrested for them. And then ultimately, Berkman comes out of prison, and they're working together for many years to press the anarchist cause in the United States through publications and public speaking and through interaction with major labor unions. But the government is really kind of watching them closely the whole time. And when they stand out against the military draft in the United States during World War I, that's when they get arrested and imprisoned for 2 years. And then the next stage of the effort against them is to try to deport them. So they are really 2 sort of central examples here. And one of the contributions of my book is to take their not just their kind of experiences and quirky ideas seriously, but their political and legal ideas seriously, because these are people who define themselves in their movement as the opposite of law, right? Anarchism is about a world without law, but nonetheless, they end up in order to exercise self-preservation, among other things, they end up engaging with the legal system and getting involved in some really high-level cases that go all the way to the Supreme Court.
That's very interesting, and thank you very much for those examples. So now let's just briefly get into the discussion of the scholarly works that you are in conversation with, because I understand we already have a body of knowledge on the progressive era, even on anarchism in the United States. So what would you say is the scholarly contribution of your book? Does it challenge conventional interpretations? Does it complement conventional interpretation?
Yeah, so one of the main contributions is in the history of civil liberties in the United States, which for for the American public is a really big
Oh, yes, yes,
big
yes,
topic, right?
yes.
And the history of the First Amendment, and this book really uh, restores anarchists to that story, anarchists and their lawyers, um, to that history, and shows the significance of anarchist efforts to sort of uh, pushing the controversies that would ultimately lead to the development of a larger, more mainstream movement for civil liberties, and even some decisions on, or some opinions on, the U.S. Supreme Court that would lay the foundation for modern understandings of freedom, freedom to speak out against the government, which was not a given in American history. So that's one sort of contribution, is to look at anarchists as social and legal actors, and to take their ideas seriously. Another contribution is to really dig into the workings of the American state during this period. There is a large literature now, among legal historians in particular, on the rise of the modern administrative state, right? This a more centralized American government that governs through administrative power rather than simply through courts. And this in this book, I'm really putting immigration law enforcement, and particularly immigration law enforcement aimed at political dissent. I'm really putting that at the center of this story of state building, and I'm really showing how the political actors who built the modern American administrative state were distinct individuals with some with very different ideas about and very different concerns about the extent of government power. So I really sort of restore the conflict within the state itself around the question of what to do about these non-citizen anarchists. There's also a story of New York City here that I think will be really engaging to readers. All of this is taking place in the sort of the shifting ground of America's great city of the era, the largest receiving center for immigrants in the United States during this period, the cultural center of its avant-garde, the largest concentration of Jewish immigrants in the United States, and of course the preeminent center of American capitalism. And so I really, this is a narrative that really plays out across the landscape of Manhattan during this extraordinary period of change. So those are some of the contributions. And in terms of the literature on anarchism itself, my book really centers in a way that has not been done before the impact of the movement and its history on the American system of justice and the judiciary.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So now, the emphasis of your book is obviously on immigrant radicals. And, you know, one of the things that got me wondering, and I remember asking you this question again when you did the presentation here, but it would be interesting to have you answer it before our student audience here for this particular program. Was there anything that was specifically or maybe particularly and outstandingly unique about immigrants as a group that made them radical in their conduct?
So I think that first off, there was an American, a kind of native-born tradition of, individualism that included voices that really pushed individualism to the almost to the edges of what we would now call anarchism, with Thoreau, for example, and his famous essay on civil disobedience in the pre-Civil War period. And the anarchists really also, the immigrant anarchists really tapped into the revolutionary tradition in American life, the fact that this was a country born of a revolution, the fact that in recent memory, the institution of slavery had been destroyed through a civil war and an uprising by enslaved people themselves. And so they frequently invoked American history. And then as far as the immigrants themselves, I think many immigrants coming to the United States were in fact quite conservative. Um, even after their arrival, they were seeking to establish homes and families and preserve folkways and religion in their communities. So someone like Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman and their folks who gravitated towards their anarchist milieu, they are radical within their own communities as well. So I guess that's a kind of main point. But I think it's what's distinctive about many of these folks that I write about is how intellectual they were, how consumed they were with every opportunity to read literature and read the political writings of folks like Tolstoy, and from whom they gained inspiration, or Kropotkin, the Russian anarchists, or Proudhon, the French anarchists. They were circulating these little treatises and arguments and books and pamphlets amongst themselves, even as they were working very long days in factories. And then there was a very strong sense among them that united them, that the United States, notwithstanding the promise of liberty, right, the myth of American liberty that had been one of the reasons many immigrants came to the United States in the first place, that idea was seriously compromised by the way in which industrial capitalism was developing in the United States, and the brutal police suppression of the labor movement, and the harsh treatment of immigrants in the country, and so on. So I really think it's the combination of a kind of mindset that was rebellious to begin with the harsh social conditions that they experience in American cities like Chicago, New York, San Francisco, and Butte, Montana, and other places, that led some individuals to embrace really the most radical of all these political ideas during this period.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. Now, my last question for you. This has been an interesting discussion, which I know for a fact must benefit some people out there, and some people out there must benefit even from reading the books. When you were writing, and even after the book was out, what was your target audience? What is the target audience of the book, and who will greatly benefit if they are to get their hands on this book?
Yeah, so this book is really aimed at the reader of history. It's aimed at non-specialists as well as specialists. Of course, I want to, excuse me. Of course, I want to persuade my scholarly colleagues that there's a scholarly contribution here,
Mm-hmm.
but I also want to be writing for the interested general reader. And so this book is published with Basic Books, which is a commercial press that publishes serious nonfiction. It's not a university press with a target audience of university faculty and graduate students. It's I mean, it of course is aiming at those audiences, but also wants to um, get to reach the lover of books who might come across this in a bookstore, or hear about it on your program, or read about it in a book review, have their interest sparked, get a copy from the library or purchase a copy and read it. So it's written to be accessible to a broad range of readers, and there's a driving story at the heart of it, as well as a scholarly argument.
Mhm.
So I always had in my mind, as I was writing, um, readers beyond my colleagues, readers beyond my PhD students,
Mhm.
and hopefully the book is reaching a wide audience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I am very grateful of having you on this show today, Professor Michael Willrich. Viewers and listeners, those of you who would want to buy a copy of this book, American Anarchy, you can get it right in the description panel on the upload for this video. If you click the link, you can directly get the access to purchase it and to have it right delivered to your doors. Professor Michael, I'm grateful of having you today. I'm the most excited man.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much and have a good day.
You too.